So I think with that, I will go ahead and get us started, because I am really excited about this panel tonight and our two guest speakers. The national security issues that have been in the news of late, I think, have been really interesting to everybody, and getting to talk to a journalist and a lawyer on the same night, on the same panel, I thought would make for a fun conversation. So, and as a reminder, this is our monthly Tuesday roundtable meeting. We do these every month, or we try to do them every month about the same time. We will be recording, and we will post this on our YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and see it later, it will be available. If you want to tell all your friends, it will be available later on. So with that said, I am going to jump in, and I'm going to introduce Frank and Kel. And I'm going to start with Frank, I think, just because he's got such an amazing long bio. And I've enjoyed our chats so much offline, and I know Kel really well also. And I just think we're just gonna have fun tonight. So Frank, why don't you kick us off and tell us who Frank is and a little bit about your background?
Well, it's what's left of me that I'm going to discuss.
Oh,
Because
okay.
I've been in the whistleblower business from very different angles. I was one of the original national security whistleblowers. I generated a Supreme Court decision that is in many ways a landmark decision for whistleblowers. I then went on to a 30-year, by the way, that was when I was a CIA officer.
Mm-hmm.
I served in Vietnam for 5.5 years. I was in the agency a little longer than that. I was one of the last people to come off the roof of the U.S. Embassy, April 29th, 1975. After I got into a battle with the United States government over a book I wrote about the fall of Vietnam, I went on and became an investigative journalist for all of the big three networks and for other outlets. I continue to do a lot of writing on every subject, and I have a rather unique view on whistleblowing because I was able to see it from the inside as a whistleblower and also as a journalist, and I've used whistleblowers in my story, and I have very definite views as to how journalists should interact with whistleblowers and how they should manage them. So with that, I'll bow out. Kel, I guess it's your turn to say howdy.
Howdy. My name is Kel McClanahan. I am the lawyer of this journalist-lawyer pairing. I have been doing this for, I'm surprised to say, 15 years now, and which sort of comes as a surprise to me every time I think about it. I had lots of hair when I started, and I do not now, so that should tell you about being a whistleblower lawyer and a national security lawyer. I tend to represent people as this pairing would suggest, who are national security whistleblowers, both in the administrative process of filing a whistleblower complaint or talking to Congress or something like that, and also in all of the peripheral matters, like trying to get a book published because there's this annoying case called Snepp v. United States that ruined it for the rest of us, and that made us have to jump through all these hoops now. And so I do that. I also do a lot of open transparency stuff with Freedom of Information Act, declassification, and whatnot for both whistleblowers, but also for journalists or just members of the public who are out there doing stuff like this. And I will not bring anywhere near the breadth of experience to this chat that Frank will, but hopefully I can help some people from making the missteps that we have made along the way.
So, Kel, I'm going to ask you, though, there's a lot in what you said that we need to unpack, because I want to make sure, one, we're all on the same page. And I have a couple of students that I see have logged in. So for just the purposes of setting the stage, what is national security whistleblower law? What does that mean? Let's start with that. Because I know everybody's thinking, is that Snowden? Like, where do we start with?
Yes and no. So national security law, I teach a class in this, and Jackie knows this, and so she's basically trying to get me to regurgitate my class. National security law, quote unquote, is really a loose amalgamation of exceptions to all the other different types of law. That even if you don't get to whistleblower law, it's when you're not dealing with can we bomb somebody or can we spy on somebody, sort of law of war or straight espionage. You're looking at a field where every field of law that you normally deal with, torts, criminal law, divorce law, in contracts, everything sort of warps out of recognition when it touches the idea of national security. And so an exception is created. And that exception is sort of where I live. That if someone says they're a national security lawyer, they're generally, if they're not working for CIA or the White House or something, a subset of that. They're a national security employment lawyer, like I am. They're a national security whistleblower lawyer, like I am. Something like that. They deal with national security contracts or government contracts. And so for national security whistleblower law, that is really the area that normal whistleblower law doesn't reach. The Whistleblower Protection Act does not apply to the intelligence community. Instead, they have this mishmash of things called the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act that is one of the worst named statutes in the world because it has no protections in it, despite being in the name. You have PPD 19, Presidential Policy Directive 19, that is a presidential policy directive that has also been incorporated sort of into a statute that has conflicting terms in some areas. But that stuff is what a national security whistleblower lawyer works with and what you would normally think of when you say that term.
Okay. So my question is, or I think where we can really start to pivot and kick off this discussion tonight, or what does the American public or what does the world have a right to know about what we do as a government? What are those limitations? I mean, we get into that squirrely area of, well, we can't release that because it's privacy protected or it's national security protected. I mean, what does the public have a right to know? And I was an Army officer, took my oath for God and country. Where are those areas? And Frank, this is where I think your story becomes so compelling is, so what do we as the public have a right to know versus what really does protect our national security?
Well, it really depends on what lawsuit you're talking about or what law you're talking about. Let's look at the Pentagon Papers case, just for starters. The Pentagon Papers case was hailed in real time as a real breakthrough for whistleblowers, for everybody who loves the First Amendment. What the court really did was whiff. They didn't say very much at all. In effect, the ruling simply said that the New York Times, the Washington Post, other newspapers wanted to publish national security secrets in the public interest, and the court said that the government had not borne the burden of proof needed to stop publication. That was it. There are all sorts of per curiam opinions, that's pinnacle opinions that tried to define what this meant. But the whole area was wide open, and that's because Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, which means when speech is abridged, it's all about finding ways around that prohibition. And also, much depends on judges who are not experts in national security and who tend instinctively to be deferential towards the US government. So if you're looking for the law for protection, that's a problem. Okay, I've just told you what the Pentagon Papers case stood for, and not very much. My situation was next up on the docket, if you will, in the national security area. I'm being a little simplistic about it because there was the Marchetti case, there were other cases around, but let's stick with this straight line narrative here. Here comes Frank Snepp. I'm a very young and idealistic CIA officer. The Vietnam War ends. I was one of the last people to come off the roof of the embassy. Because of strange circumstances, namely because I look so innocent, I was given responsibility for analyzing communist intentions for 5.5 years in Vietnam itself. My job thus exposed me and required that I be exposed to the highest levels of national security information in Vietnam. I was in direct contact with our best source in Hanoi. I dealt directly with our best penetration agent inside the Communist Command in the South. I was required to brief the ambassador regularly, to visiting Washington officials, and write analyses for Washington. I was up to my eyelashes in secrets, and I mean every one of them, not operational secrets like what kind of paraphernalia we're using to collect information, but the substantive secrets, the stuff that is the heart of the kind of thing a whistleblower will eventually deal with. Well, what happened to me was I saw so much and I knew so much by the time the war ended, not because I was special, it was just a function of the job I had. When I got back to CIA headquarters, I said, look, guys, we should do a post-mortem on what went wrong in Vietnam, why we didn't get all of our agents out, why the evacuation was every man, woman, and child for themselves at the end, so that this will never happen again. And everybody said to me, literally from the State Department, the CIA to the White House, Frank, why don't you go away and let's move on to the next problem? And I said, well, I was feeling very guilty, folks. I had served 6.5 years on the Vietnam account, 5.5 years in the war. I had a lot of bad stuff on my conscience, and I didn't want to leave it at that. Furthermore, most of my friends had been left behind. So I said, look, guys, if you won't do a post-mortem, I'm going to do one myself. They said, I don't think so. I said, well, I guess I'll have to resign. And I did. And I did. I wrote a book about the fall of Saigon called Decent Interval. It was based on what I had experienced firsthand. It was published in November 1977 to huge fanfare. I debuted on 60 Minutes. You can still see the interview. The US government decided to prosecute me. Initially, they looked at the espionage laws, but there was a problem with what information I had put before the public. It was already compromised. The fall of a country tends to compromise the secrets you have. And we had left behind classified documents, agents, and whatever. And when I wrote my book, I said to myself, I want to expose what happened, but I don't want to do any further injury to the Vietnamese we left behind. So I wrote this book with a deliberate intent of talking around the secrets, not exposing secrets. So I was a little strange in that regard. I wasn't a whistleblower who was out to expose secrets. I wanted to pull the narrative together so that we could all understand it and basically atone and learn from it. Well, the government sued me, and they decided, because the Espionage Acts wouldn't work against me, and there were a lot of reasons for that, but not worth discussing here. They prosecuted me under civil law, and not just any civil law, because there is no law covering for exactly what my case involved. I published a book that the government didn't like, and at the very outset of the lawsuit, they stipulated there were no secrets in it, at least in terms of this litigation, which, folks, meant that Frank Snepp had published a secrets-free book. And yet, the government argued, in order to substantiate this prosecution, that what I had done, I'd flaunted the CIA's pre-publication review rules, which didn't really exist at the time, and I published without clearance. They argued, get this, it's very hard to understand. They argued that I had created the appearance of a breakdown in CI security procedures, and that might encourage various serious leakers. Now, if you haven't quite followed that, imagine yours truly in court. I said, what? You're prosecuting me for creating an illusion or appearance of a breakdown in security? And they tacked on all sorts of other stuff. They said, well, I'd broken a contract, even though I had 5 contracts with a CI, and none of them said the same thing. So they finally said, Frank, what we're really doing is we're prosecuting you as if you were a stable boy and you had stolen your master's horse. In other words, information in this case.
Yeah.
When you've taken it away,
Horse
we want you to bring the horse back. And since you can't, we're going to den you for everything you are worth. So they prosecuted me. They said that I had irreparably harmed the national security by publishing a book that contains no secrets but created the appearance of a breakdown in secrecy. If you're following this, you're better than most constitutional experts. And then they said, we're going to gag you for life so that you'll never write again. And we're going to impose a constructive trust, which means, folks, they're going to take every cent I had. Okay? Well, I went through the trial court. The judge, who was a crusty old fellow, loved the CI. He decided not to call a jury and ruled from the bench. And he said that these people can't take these secrets and just get away with it. And he ruled against me. Well, we went up the chain of appeal. I lost. It was a very important case because nobody'd seen a case, a national security case, where no classified information was at issue. It was a combination of contract law, the law of trust. They said that I had an invisible trust to have cleared this book, and on and on. Well, we get to the U.S. Supreme Court, and this is where it really gets fun. We asked to have my case heard. We applied for certiorari. I will tell everybody, that's what it means when you try to get a hearing. We got to the Supreme Court level. We waited and we waited, and when there was the Iran hostage crisis took place, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Everybody was excited about national security, and my case reached the Supreme Court amidst all of this. And I want you to understand, you whistleblowers out there, don't whistleblow in the middle of a crisis. It gets bad if you do. And that's what happened here. My book hit the Supreme Court, not only in the midst of the Iran crisis, hostage crisis, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It got to the Supreme Court at the very moment that Bob Woodward and Scott Armstrong had published a book about the court, a very critical book, based on leaks from the Supreme Court itself. So the court's all pissed off about leakers and whistleblowers. My case hits the deck right then. You want to guess how it came out? Well, it came out surprising. One day, my lawyers hadn't argued the case. The government hadn't argued the case. Nobody had taken briefs to the Supreme Court. One of my lawyers called me up and he said, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, the Supreme Court has not only taken your case, they've decided it." What? We haven't argued the case. They've decided it summarily. It was a shadow docket case. It was an anticipation of what's known as the shadow docket, where the Supreme Court these days just makes decisions without hearing cases. Anyway, we won't get into that. But the point is, I'm sitting there. I am gagged for life. I've been a screenwriter. My screenplays have to be cleared. I've written for television, dramatic television. My screenplays are cleared. Fiction, poetry. If I wrote about the CI's cafeteria menu, it would have to be cleared. Okay? Not only that, they took every cent I owned. I mean, literally every dime I owned. I even had to pay back income tax that I'd already paid the government. I had to pay the equivalent. I was in the streets. I was literally a street person overnight. And they established, more importantly than all my adventures, they established a precedent, which now governs every former government employee who has had anything to do with national security information, or could have. The principle is very simple. It is, if you're a government employee and in a position of trust, you are obligated under contract, under the law of trusts, under a whole panoply of very confusing things from a layman, to clear every damn thing you write. And maybe you ought to do more, because you never know. So you overcompensate and you clear everything. But being very serious about it, what it did, it means this, that if you've been in government service and you write about your experiences, you have to clear it with the censors. You are subject to pre-publication review or prior restraint, which was the dirtiest word in the lexicon of the First Amendment. Prior restraint is the thing. It should be just impossible. I am subject to lifelong prior restraint by the government. Going back to the Pentagon Papers case, remember in the beginning I said they came up with the rule, yet the government had to show some kind of damage. In this case, no. I'm subject to lifelong censorship without any showing that I've damaged anything or anybody. So now that everybody's asleep, you understand, you understand why I'm a little bit cynical about First Amendment law, Kyle, and Kel, I'm sorry. And I don't believe even today that the whistleblower protections that are available are sufficient. And just so you understand where I'm coming from, and then I'll shut up. I apologize for monopolizing this discussion.
No, I've got more questions for you. Don't worry.
Okay, here we go. But look, there are all sorts of ways of whistleblowing. Whistleblowing, number one, and also how you do it and what you do determines what you're whistleblowing about. Okay. Yeah. You can, disclosures having to do with national security can focus on a single event like the My Lai massacre, or like whatever, pick one single event, or like a telephone call made by President Trump to Zelensky, and so on and on. It can deal with a single event. And it also, whistleblowing can deal with a big event like a war. That's what my whistleblowing was about. There are better protections for national security whistleblowers who only whistleblow about a small single event. If you whistleblow about a big event, you have two choices: leak or write a book. Leaking is subject to persecution, prosecution under the espionage. And if you write a book and don't clear it, baby, you're subject to the precedent in my case. So again, and if you write about or you leak about, whistleblower about one single event, then the whistleblower protections really do begin to come into play. I mean, you can look at the case of the whistleblower who blew the Zelensky-Trump conversation. Mm-hmm. And that played out very interesting, sort of a wonderful little scenario, the way it should work. So now that I've put everybody to sleep,
I think that, again, a lot in that. It was a good long narrative summary of things that I know took place over decades. But I want to come back to, the people who know me know where I'm going to go next. So how did you cope? I was really touched when you said that what weighed on your mind after Vietnam, and I started my career with Vietnam vets. So, the death toll, the body count that they used to like to talk about, those things mean something. I mean, they touch us in a very personal way when we know that there's such harm being done. So you went from, and I call that the 1-2 punch, right? I mean, the first punch is we know something went wrong. The second punch is when we try to do something about the first punch. So over all of this, and you've obviously had a very interesting career, on the inside, how did you cope? How did you stay sane? How did you keep your outlook? How did you keep moving to the next step? Because that moving forward sometimes, I think, is what we struggle with as whistleblowers. So how did you do it?
I was devastated. I was suffering PTSD before anybody knew what it meant. That wasn't known about until 1980. I came back, and I felt I had to atone. I had been I kept saying to myself, what if I should have done something different? I should have punched the ambassador in the face. I should have leaked more. I should have, and I knew what I had to do was to throw the debris on a blank page and turn it into a narrative that would enable me or allow me to atone, and I mean atone, to admit to myself, to subject myself to the punishment of memory. And I was broken. I wept. I had left one person, a woman, had called me right before the evacuation and said she had my child, that she had born my child, and I hadn't known about it. Get her out. And I couldn't get her out, and she killed herself and the child. So I crawled out of Vietnam, clung to helicopters getting out of Vietnam, and my heart was broken. And I looked around when I got back. You got to realize I lived in a closed world as a CIA agent. I got out and I looked at American families who had lost someone in the war, and I said, they deserve to know why their kids died in this damn war. And it became a religious crusade for me. I'm not religious, but it became that passionate. But I want to tell you something, and everybody who's listening who thinks she or he knows about whistleblowing, it's a blood sport, and no one who does it gets out whole. Never, ever. To this day, I may sound glib and whatever, but it has been a hard journey, baby. And it is because I wrote, Jackie. They will tell you, if you have PTSD, the first cell therapy is writing out the story. I wrote a damn book about it, and I keep writing. Even to this day, I keep expunging or exorcising the ghost.
No, I agree. I do a lot of writing too. I did not have the Pentagon clear my book, so maybe I shouldn't show it, but I did this. I wrote about the psychosocial impacts of whistleblower retaliation because I was trying to understand my own experience. I thought I was going to have a glorious government career. I was at the Pentagon working with combat vets, combat trauma, and suicide prevention, areas I loved and was passionate about, and had to walk away from. And there's kind of an ironic that what brought me to this was when I was a very young social worker in the 1980s, working with Vietnam combat vets who are our young vets. I had gotten a call from the police, and one of my Vietnam vets, a Marine, had killed himself, and he had left me a suicide note. And one of the lines in the note was, "Never think there's anything more you could have done." And every time I think about that, I always think, no, there is more. Maybe not me personally could have done, but we as a profession could have done. And I got a bunch of my social workers listening. There is always more we can do. We have to make our professions better. And I think we do that through the narrative. And I always say to people, own your narrative, own your words. Never let anybody tell you who you are or define who you are. That these are your stories, your words, your experiences, and you have to capture them. And Frank, that's why I feel so compelled for you to tell your story, and then to think about how do we move to the next steps. And part of that next step, because one of the other things I always tell somebody, before you tell your story, tell it to an attorney and have them help you figure out how to tell your story and when you should tell your story. And I know, Kel, you've been in the corner there. What do you do when somebody like Frank comes into your office and, you're getting this data dump? How do you help them sort through that?
Well, so I'm going to back up a step there, and I'm going to say that in the 40 years since that case, the interpretation of pre-publication has been redefined, and you are, I'll say guilty, but it's not criminal guilt. It's just sort of liable under the law, you have violated the pre-publication review rules in the view of pretty much everybody in the U.S. government, from the agencies to the courts to
Kyle,
the Congress.
yeah, I want to interrupt you something. There were no pre-publication review rules when I began writing. There was no pre-publication board. So it was invented, that review system was invented as they prepared to take me to court. So I violated what? I'm not sure to this day, but I will defer to your narrative.
But since then, there are lots of rules. One of the problems is each agency has its own rules. There's a whole sordid history behind that I won't go into. But the bottom line, to Jackie's point, is publication in pre-publication review means now dissemination outside of the agency. That means telling your lawyer. And so,
and you tell your lawyer?
No, if you are worried about, say, losing your security clearance or something, then you have to jump through some very, very narrow hoops. You cannot just walk into someone's office. Frank can't walk into my office and info dump, here's all the classified information I want to write a book about, or hand me a copy of his book and say, how do I publish this? I've had to deal with cases where I'm in litigation right now out in Texas over a book I have not read. And I'm fighting against a declaration I have not read and incorporating a response from my client that I have not read, because the court and the agency would not give me what's called a limited security access, LSA, basically a one-time only clearance, to see the classified information I'm supposed to argue they're not allowed to censor.
Well, see, that's part of the problem. From the very beginning, all this is new stuff. I couldn't get a lawyer, and no one knew how to get one for me for that very reason.
Yeah.
And that's one of my problems. They can hold up your security clearance and therefore make litigation against them that much more difficult. The whole system is still rigged in the government's favor. I just say rigged. Because
it's totally rigged. I will say it's rigged.
There's a lot of head nodding going on.
Yeah. This is definitely an issue, and it is definitely a scenario that no lawyer ever wants to find themselves in, and no
what do you
wants to find themselves in.
What do you do? I mean, what do you do in this situation?
Well,
are you in this situation?
There are a few different things. Number one, some agencies are more understanding than others about giving you permission. For instance, I have submitted manuscripts on behalf of my clients to some agencies that just don't care. They don't interpret it that way. CIA is not one of those. CIA says you cannot say it in your sleep because your wife might overhear you. Other agencies, they have a form that you fill out when you're submitting a document for pre-publication on review on behalf of the client. What's his name? Bolton, his lawyer participated in the negotiations.
Oh, I know. His lawyer talked to me, actually.
And so what you can do is be famous and high-powered, and then your lawyer will get lots of benefits. And when you're not famous or high-powered, they don't. I say that somewhat flippantly, but there is truth to that. Hillary Clinton's lawyer had a safe installed by the State Department for a flash drive that had her classified records on it so that he could aid her in testifying before Congress. And the same State Department will die on the Hill before they let me know a confidential menu item they had in an embassy in Karachi. And so there is a bit of a double standard there. The reason for that, though, is that what Frank calls it being rigged, and I agree it's rigged, is this idea that is handed down from the Supreme Court that whenever an executive branch agency says something about national security, it is entitled to what's called utmost deference. Mm-hmm. And utmost deference literally means we can't think of an exception that overcomes it. I have never seen an exception that overcame utmost deference.
Yeah.
What you can do when you're fighting against utmost deference is say, well, they're entitled to utmost deference about the harm, but they're not entitled to utmost deference about the process or something like that, and sort of cabin it to the specific things. But because of cases like Frank's case and Marchetti, the one he mentioned before, and other cases, Hopkins v. Helms is another one. That's the one that came up with utmost deference, or popularized it rather. That judges will bend over backwards to say they are absolute morons who cannot find their way out of a paper bag if someone has stamped the paper bag top secret.
Yeah, well, that's judicial review is useless as really review. But I want to just shoot this into your bucket because I'd love for you to address it. I continue to have to clear stuff with the agency, obviously, and so I'm dealing, and I've litigated against them. One time I went back and litigated because they sat on a manuscript for 2 years. They vest pocket vetoed it. And I tried to get them to accept a 30-day clearance rule, and I took it all the way back to the Supreme Court. This time the Supreme Court wouldn't hear it and left the confusion intact, which that means, as you know, there's no time you can call, hey, time out, I publish, you missed the deadline. There's no deadline, so they can just vest pocket veto you to death.
That is true.
And it means I have to pay you to keep representing me.
Yeah.
Nobody has that money. Nobody has that kind of money.
Hey, now, I'm a nonprofit. I do not charge.
Okay, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
You might not be able to pay
you.
Mark, but you can pay me. You know?
Yeah. So, and I realize we could probably go back and forth here all night, but I do, I always try to bring in the audience or make sure they know they can ask questions. They can either ask questions or make comments in the chat or just say hello in the chat. I know Paul is listening, or I hope Paul is listening, and I know he's got a little bit of a cyber background, because I think that adds a new dimension to what's national security and how we look at what are national security issues. You mentioned the security clearance. I know a lot of folks have had their security clearance threatened when they're whistleblowers. I mean, that's a big fear, trying to either protect your security clearance or get it back after it's been gone. Or so I'm gonna, I'm leaving the moment open. If anybody wants to raise a hand, ask a question, put it in the chat. I thought I would pause because I didn't even realize myself how fast the time has gone in this discussion. Okay, so Betsy has her hand up. Betsy, you wanna?
Hi. Just to give you, I'm an intern at the Whistleblowers of America. Jackie is my supervisor. I'm very grateful to be here. One of the things that struck me as I was listening to you two gentlemen is, because I'm an older student by traditional standards, I remember my parents watching the news about Pentagon Papers and Watergate and Nixon, and being furious. And I'm sitting here thinking at 59 years old, nothing's changed, except for that maybe people are speaking out more and they're getting their hands slapped even harder. But that's one of the takeaways I have is, my gosh, I was 7 years old in 1972, watching my parents freaking out about the Pentagon Papers and the breaking in Watergate, and it being a family lesson in civics, which was wonderful and has stuck with me. But wow, it's not like nothing changed.
Frank, do you agree with that? Has nothing changed? Has it gotten better or worse?
Here's my feeling about it. No, whistleblowing it's a perennial, and thank God for it. I'm really talking about leakers because that's the way whistleblowers sort of begin. That's the first, and we are seeing in the Gaza crisis leaks that I haven't seen in a long time. We have official leaks, but we have leakers who are protesting, for instance, the U.S.'s failure to really decide whether or not the bombing in Gaza violates regulations of our own that require that our arms be used in accordance with international law. Whistleblowers are talking to Axios. Axios is one. Politico is one major outlet. They're talking to David Ignatius of the Washington Post. They're talking to Politico. Whistleblowers are everywhere. So much so that Secretary of State Blinken just a few days ago said, "Hey guys, cut it out. You leakers are making it difficult for me to conduct diplomacy."
Well, I think
yes, it is.
That's an interesting point, though, is we've got more social media than we've ever had before, too. Anybody who knows how to, post on LinkedIn or Facebook knows how to leak, knows how to tell a story.
Well, one of the things, though, I wanted to just interject
And
there, because I
Jane
think
has her hand up too, so I want to get to Jane.
Well,
go ahead, Frank.
But whistleblowing has become a cottage industry, and therefore, I think we should note, at least I think it's important, I want to express this view. Whistleblowers have an obligation. The obligation is to be ready to answer for their actions. I do not approve of Edward Snowden's going off to Russia and hiding out there. I approve of Daniel Ellsberg's model. He leaked, he whistleblew, and then he stayed and faced the music. That's the only way you can preserve the order and law in this environment. Anyway.
No, I agree with you. I always feel like the Catherine Gunn story is a better than an Edward Snowden story, because Catherine Gunn, the British analyst who stayed and made them adjudicate her case, and face the music, but she made them face the music too. They couldn't prosecute her without prosecuting themselves. And I thought that was poetic justice. But Jane, I want to bring you into the conversation. Jane's a former FBI agent. I feel like everybody knows Jane Turner, but if you would say hi, introduce yourself, the ever lovely, marvelous Miss Turner, please join. Jane, can you unmute? Paul, can you unmute her?
She should be able, she should have the ability to unmute herself.
Okay.
If you're looking for it, it's at the bottom of the screen, all the way to the left.
Well, and maybe while we're waiting for Jane, Paul, I mentioned you earlier. What do you think about the cybersecurity threat issues?
So one thing, oh wait, am I muted?
No, yeah, I can hear you.
So one thing that I think is, by the way, Kel was my attorney and did a great job, and I definitely learned a lot. I don't have a law background. I spent my entire life pretty much in computers, so all this stuff is just brand new to me. But as far as from this cybersecurity portion of it, there's a lot of people creating bogus IT or cybersecurity company or companies with very poor or just built on old programming models. And sometimes they'll use, say that it's classified. They won't allow like security analysts to actually, bring forward the inequities of the products that they create, because maybe their friend or somebody in Silicon Valley gave them a lot of money. But that's one thing I definitely think is, from my perspective, I think is very interesting.
And Jane, did we get you back? I think I saw you come off and come back on. I think she might be having some.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you, lovely Jackie. And there's Ted up there looking handsome. Frank, nice to meet you. I've heard about you, and it's really a pleasure. And I've heard about you, Kel. I'm an advocate for whistleblowers, and I was curious, Frank, about Jeffrey Wigand. How in the world was your case used against a tobacco whistleblower?
It's very interesting, and I got involved in that. I knew Mike Wallace in one of my incarnations. basically the story, in case people don't know, Jeffrey Wigand blew the whistle on Brown and Williamson, the cigarette company. He had worked for them. He had signed a non-disclosure agreement with them. He gave an interview to CBS 60 Minutes, and the Brown and Williamson came in, hey guys, we have a precedent known as U.S. versus Snepp that says people who have non-disclosure agreements can't give unimproved interviews. We don't approve of this one. CBS, don't do it. And to everybody's amazement, CBS didn't for about a half year. They canned that interview, and finally they aired it. But what that told us was just how slippery and elastic the rule was in U.S. versus Snepp. How was it that a ruling against me, a CIA agent, was used to try to stop not only Brown and Williamson's whistleblower, but persuaded 60 Minutes to can the damn interview?
Wow.
That's how insidious the ruling in my case was. And that's what happened. And it sounds weird, but Wigand suffered because of what I did. And he did much more righteous stuff than I did. So I was appalled. And I argued with Mike Wallace about it. I was, back in my youth, I was his intern at one point. And so I told him, I said, how could you have sat on this interview? It's contrary to everything journalism stands for.
Right. Wow. Thanks, Jackie, for having these two really interesting people on. Really interesting. Frank, I hope I can get your contact information.
Yeah, Jane, I think you make a great story.
Yeah.
But what happened to him since, right?
Yeah.
A revisit.
And it's funny, I was talking to Jeffrey just a couple days ago. I'm trying to get him to come to National Whistleblower Day in Washington. But boy, he's sometimes people can either hide in the woods or come out fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting.
Flight.
Yeah, fight or flight.
Fight, freeze.
But I like your description. Oh, yes. I like your description. It's called a blood sport. I call it a life sentence. Yeah. Whistleblowing. Yeah. Brutal. But thank you, Jackie, for having these two great speakers on.
Well, and thank you for joining us, Miss Turner.
Yeah.
In case people don't know, as I said, Jane was the FBI whistleblower back in the day about child welfare abuses on Native American reservations. Trying to make that public didn't help her career in one way, but it certainly gave us an icon in another way, because Jane writes the Whistleblower News Network and helps whistleblowers tell their story, because not everybody is as prolific and great a writer as Frank is. I know Ted has published a book.
Ted has got a great book.
Yes. Ted, do you want to say hello and talk about what it's like to tell your story? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, this is great, Frank and Kel, having you on. It's a different dimension of whistleblowing. And of course, in the national security arena, it's a whole different animal than what you're going to experience in other levels of government and corporate America. But just real quick here, I'm a retired Marine and combat veteran, and I work for the VA doing counseling with combat veterans in the Vet Center program for the VA for 9 years. And I became a whistleblower over the fact that there were harmful policies that were implemented for council productivity that were burning them out and compromising quality care for veterans. So I ended up, going through the whole shebang, paid a heavy price, like most whistleblowers do with the usual stuff, and ended up having congressional legislation after GAO investigation validated my allegations, getting passed by Congress to hold the VA accountable to protect the mental health and welfare of veterans and the counselors in the VA. So my book is entitled Broken Promises, about the whole ordeal, where I address the issues as well as specifically the retaliation and the impact it had, because the general public doesn't really understand what whistleblowers go through and how horrific it really is. And people need to know that, so we can get using that as an impetus behind getting stronger legislation to truly protect and support whistleblowers. So I addressed that as well, and as well as a blueprint on how to have the most favorable outcome possible when taking on these kinds of things. In my case, I was fortunate. It led to where it did, having the U.S. Congress back me up and actually pass something in law to correct it. But that's basically it in a nutshell. And the reason Broken Promises is the title is because that's the antithesis to the VA's logo, keeping the promise. And interestingly, when my book was published, they changed the logo. They dropped keeping the promises and changed it to commitment and something else, and which was kind of interesting. But anyway, that's the quick nickel summary of my my whistleblowing.
No, thank you for
Perfect.
sharing that. Is there anybody else on who hasn't had a chance to make a comment or ask a question before we start to wrap up? Carmel, did you want to say hello?
Hi, I did say hello before we started, but I'm also an intern, and I thank Jackie as well for this great opportunity. But I just wanted to say to Frank that I think, as I was telling you earlier, how I was interested in working for the FBI and such. I feel that you've done a really great job, and you as opposed to like looking at the bigger picture, as opposed to standing up for like an agency that you belong to, you stood up for what was morally right. For the Vietnamese people that were left behind, and I was reading a little bit about it as you were speaking. And so you stood up for what was morally right, and I think that you did a great and just thing for society, because that's brave, and you lost all, you lost your money and your place to live to do that. So I just wanted to commend you and let you know that, great job.
I really appreciate that. I wanted to say one thing, just so it's not misunderstood. I'm not a hater of the CIA or the government. I actually believe that national security must be protected, and it's part of my job to do it. And I think whistleblowing is part of that job if it's done responsibly, and if you're willing to stand up and be counted afterwards. Face the music. That's part of the responsibility.
No, thank
Right.
you. I appreciate that clarification, because I think everybody here would agree that, especially those of us who were federal government whistleblowers, and I think that's most of us on the call tonight. I can't see everybody, but I think being a government employee, especially for those of us who are veterans, you take an oath of office, you take that seriously. And I think that's always part of the decision that you make, is that you're weighing, what is the greater good? What's the public interest in all of this to what protects us as a nation? And I get how important that is. I spent 8 years at the Pentagon with, phone calls at 2 a.m. because something was going to go wrong and we were going to have to be ready. And so I get some of the same things that you're talking about. Is there anybody else? I always say I try to keep these to an hour. I promise everybody that it's a good way for us to get down and dirty for a little bit, talk about something really important to all of us. If you want to connect, or you want to put a note in the chat, Wanda, thank you for your comments. I'm glad you found this interesting. Wanda, another dear sweet whistleblower who has been through it all as well. So please feel free to let me know if you have any follow-up questions or concerns. Paul is the amazing magician behind the scenes who will get this video up and running. Frank, if you've got any links to any books or Kel court cases, anything we should embed with when we put the announcement out, Jane and I will definitely connect, make sure you and Frank are connected, because I think that will make for an interesting story too. But as we put this online, definitely want to make sure that we have some of the links to some of the things you mentioned. Maybe not everything, but if we can get your story, certainly the book, because, anything nobody wants us to read, now we all want to read. And we will put together a plan for June. I am traveling a lot. I will be in DC for the next 2 weeks. So if anybody's in DC who wants to say hi, I'll be in DC. Yeah. And then I'm going to be in Greece, and then I'm going to be in Oslo, Norway for conferences on whistleblowing. So I think I'm not back till the end of June. So stay tuned for what the June plan is going to be. We could probably do, I may be exhausted because I come home on the 24th, but if Paul will remind me, we'll work on something maybe for June 25th. Maybe we'll find a stand-in just in case I'm dead to the world by then. All right, so I thank you, and I look forward to seeing all of you again someplace soon. Our Workplace Promise Institute conference is going to be September 12th and 13th in Washington, D.C. The American Legion is hosting us in their national headquarters building at 1608 K Street, so I'm really excited about that. We're working on the agenda. If you have any ideas or topics or want to speak or be part of it, let me know. We still have spaces. And hopefully I'll see you when I am back from whipping around the continents. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Kel.
Bye-bye. See you guys.
Good night.